Love and life interested me so that I dared to knock at the door of the cosmos.
Welcome to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast. Since 2002, Sun Ra Arkive has been an extension of my personal study and sharing those discoveries with others. Our goal is dedicated to preserving the legacy of jazz musician, composer, keyboard pioneer, visionary philosopher, and band leader Sun Ra and his group of master musicians, the Sun Ra Orchestra. You can follow us online at facebook.com/Sun Ra Arkive and explore our library of articles at sunraarchive.blogspot.com.
What are words but words to use? Let's take words in return. The bad God book good says that too. Let's take words in return. The bad God book good says that too. A simple thing. It's simple true. Take words in return. There's no other way left for you. Take words in return.
Hi, Paul. It's Christopher.
Hey, Christopher.
I'd like to welcome author Paul Youngquist to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast. Greetings, Paul. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Christopher. It's a pleasure to be here.
The book that we're here to talk about is A Pure Solar World, Sun Ra and the Birth of Afrofuturism. It was published by University of Texas Press in 2016. It's available from your friendly local bookseller, as well as Amazon.com and anywhere that you get books. So before we get into the details of the motivation for the book project and your process putting the book together, I'm also interested in the archival research that you did. Can you tell me how you became a Sun Ra fan in the first place?
I can. It started in fear. That is to say, I had the great fortune to have a colleague at the Penn State University, where I worked for some time, named Billy Joe Harris, who was really into very out kinds of music, experimental stuff, and free jazz. We used to sit around together a lot and listen to this music, and we used to call it music that our girlfriends didn't like, because we were always sort of encouraged to turn it down when we were together. One Saturday afternoon, while listening to some of this stuff, Billy Joe looks at me and says, "Hey, why don't we teach a course together on free jazz?" And I thought, what a great idea, because I didn't really know that much. So it was in preparation for that course and during the actual teaching of that course that I first started to listen to Sun Ra with a certain amount of seriousness. Like I said, my encounters with him earlier had been few and kind of scary, like, whoa, this guy's music is really challenging. And it was sort of that challenge that drew me into it. Yeah, because there was something happening there that just wouldn't let me go. But I was a little afraid of it. So thanks to Billy Joe's guidance, and his company, we sort of undertook this journey into free jazz, and I started listening more and more to Sun Ra, and, these worlds just opened up. And I found myself curious, wanting to know more. So it started there. It started with listening and teaching, but then Sun Ra wouldn't let me go.
And when was that course that you taught?
Oh, the Wayback Machine. It must have been the late 90s. Yeah, mid to late 90s, we taught that course together. Team taught course, very innovative, very exciting just to be listening to this music and trying to talk about it with graduate students. But it really opened up my ears and got me going with Sun Ra.
So there was a long gestation period from teaching the course to writing the book. Sun Ra truly didn't let you go.
No, that's true. That's true. And the book sort of arose incrementally. I started simply by listening to whatever I could get a hold of. And in the 90s, it was largely CDs and then some LPs. And then went on to read about Sun Ra where I could. Of course, John Schwed's book, Space is the Place, The Lives and Times of Sun Ra, was a huge inspiration to me and taught me really how much there was to learn to Sun Ra, how complicated his lives and times were. And so the book did emerge over the course of the next decade plus as, first of all, kind of speculation, curiosity, interest, and hunger. And then I thought, well, let's just follow this, take it seriously, and write about Sun Ra. And the result was, after this time passed, A Pure Solar World.
Before you started listening to jazz and specifically free jazz, which is quite a adventurous starting point,
Yeah.
what were your musical loves before that? What music led you to be able to comprehend and want to learn more about free jazz and Sun Ra?
Yeah, that's an embarrassing question, Christopher. I'm going to answer it. It turns out, and I've thought about this, like how did I get to Sun Ra, and how was I able to hear this in a way that opened this curiosity, allowed me to pursue it? And it was all this stadium rock that was part of my life in high school, whether it was Led Zeppelin or MC5, these bands that sort of, in a live setting, opened up to improvisation. I realized that just being subject to the possibility of an extended form, at that level of volume, sort of made me curious about new sounds, or even more specifically, let's say John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu Orchestra. I was hugely into that music and was able to see them play a couple of times. And I realized in retrospect that the way they were working improvisationally and beyond sort of Western conventions sort of equipped my ears to hear Sun Ra when Sun Ra came along. Now, there was a lot he had to teach me, but it really started in that sort of rock, that jazz rock fusion that I was listening to in the 70s.
I think that path is probably not at all uncommon among many Sun Ra fans. I was raised on classic rock radio, and that was my path. I started with the Beatles, and over the years, as my ears got bigger, ended up progressing, like you said, to improvisational music. Specifically, it was getting into the music of the Grateful Dead, and their sometimes 30 to 45 minute improvisations in the quote unquote space realm. And then through that, American roots and jazz music that I think prepared me to be able to take the leap into Sun Ra. So I don't think that's uncommon, and certainly not embarrassing. When you said embarrassing, I thought you were going to say the Monkees or Hermits or the Banana Splits or something.
Yeah, it just seems like maybe it's not very hip, I should have been listening to punk or something like that. But that was the music, and you're right, it had an improvisational register that prepared me for what was to come.
We all have to get here from somewhere. It's all a part of the journey.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that Sun Ra story. In the late 70s, in the recording studio, probably around the period of UFO and On Jupiter, etc., some of the musicians in the orchestra were making fun of disco music.
Right.
And Sun Ra chastised them to not make fun of music that makes people happy, because that music represents their hopes and dreams.
Yeah. That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because for me, that music was a way of dreaming. It's a sort of dreaming beyond kind of the dreary reality that I was living in the 70s. If you remember those times, they were not necessarily the most pleasant. But it also prepared me to dream on a kind of cosmic scale with Sun Ra and allow that music to open my dreams and visions up to an even higher, you could say, more spiritual register.
Do you have a favorite go-to album or period for Sun Ra's music, or do you love it all?
I mean, I do love it all. And as you were saying earlier, it keeps expanding. There's more and more that continues to be released. But I do have a go-to album that I listen to regularly with extraordinary pleasure, and it's Discipline 27-2.
Excellent album.
Yeah, it's so joyous. I think what I love about that record, is that long second side that ends in laughter. It ends with the whole orchestra just laughing and laughing and laughing as a response to how screwed up life on Earth can be. And the response of laughter and of joy, and I sense a lot of laughter and joy in the performance video that I've seen. That's something that I find extraordinarily uplifting. And when you combine that with Sun Ra's kind of commitment to discipline and precision, I find that sets a really interesting agenda. The discipline, the precision, it leads to joy, laughter, and that kind of vision. So that's probably my favorite. I mean, I have others that I just return to over and over again, like Fireside Chat with Lucifer. That's one I love to death. So here we go, Christopher. Once we start picking our favorites, you end up naming the whole Sun Ra oeuvre.
Of course.
Choose from.
So Discipline 27 is an excellent choice.
Can I say
fully
one more?
endorse that. Oh, of course.
You got me going here. My Brother the Wind, Volume 1, the synth record. Oh,
yes.
That one just sends me. But there too, at first, the first time I heard it, I thought, what am I going to make of these sounds? Ugh. But as you listen to Sun Ra, Sun Ra educates you in how to listen to Sun Ra. And at this point, I hear those sounds and they're just so beautiful to me and so rich. And, his palette is so wide that he embraces the cosmic canvas for sound.
What was the inspiration from teaching the course and having those conversations with your friend to, I need to write a book about this? What kind of gave that idea form that you were going to jump into a project of that scope?
It didn't emerge immediately. It emerged over the course of a couple of years of kind of continuing to listen and not being able to unhear what I heard, but remaining curious about it. So I'm going to kind of go step by step, but I can see where I'll end up here. So I started immersing myself in the music, what music I could get then, mostly on CD. I read Swed's book, but I felt that I wasn't really getting a shape of two things, really. Kind of the everyday life of Sun Ra, what he was like as a guy. Swed's book is great, and it contains almost everything that's available to know about Sun Ra, it seems. But it didn't really have a narrative arc that I could easily follow. That taught me who this alien being from Saturn was. And then the second part of it was that I had a keen sense from the listening, but also from Swed's biography, that this was music that was trying to do some work. And that work was political, and it was social, and it was transformational. Work on behalf of Sun Ra's community, which starts as the Black community in the south side of Chicago, and then reaches out from there to include all Black people, and maybe at the largest sort of cosmic scope, all people all together. Well, how then could I sort of communicate this cultural political register of Sun Ra's music? The fact that it wasn't just music. That became increasingly important to me as I began talking with other Sun Ra fans and aficionados who always start by talking about the music. And that's the place to start. The music is ungodly, it's experimental, it's challenging, it's visionary. But it also, for me, has this social agenda. So I began to think about Sun Ra increasingly in his own historical and social context. And I thought to myself, hey, this guy is as important an activist as Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. The difference is that he's using not oratory, not direct action, but he's using music as his medium. So it's easy not clearly to hear maybe the social and cultural agenda and aspiration of the music. So it emerged that what I wanted to do in a book was to try to recover some of the social contexts that give Sun Ra's music such a liftoff, such a clear trajectory, and really such an explosive agenda. Now, there's one thing that happened to give a kind of momentum to that interest, the interest of writing a book. And it was the acquisition by the University of Chicago of this great trove of Sun Ra memorabilia and ephemera that was recovered from Alton Abraham's house, Alton Abraham being Sun Ra's lifetime musical sort of manager, producer, business partner, and donated, thanks to the foresight and the efforts really of John Corbett, all hail John Corbett, donated to the University of Chicago. So now there was an archive that was available for investigating the kind of everyday details of Sun Ra's life and times, including the political contexts and conditions that maybe motivated the music, and a lot of the occult traditions and beliefs that inspired the music and the activism. I felt that there might be the opportunity to locate Sun Ra in a very sort of granular and specific historical and even urban context, with all of this material now available pretty much in one place at the University of Chicago. So it was really my first research visit there. I didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of exploring. Let's look at the stuff. It was as a result of that trip to Chicago and the time I spent in the archives that I came out saying, yeah, there's a project here, and we can kind of fill in a lot of the background, cultural and social background to the music, and sort of bring new sense of dimensionality to that musical achievement.
Well, from what I understand, the actual writing of this book happened over the course of, say, 5 to 10 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say the research was about 5 years. And then, you know how books get written. The writing, maybe 5 years. But in fact, the last 2 years was when the writing actually got done. And that was largely because my editor at the University of Texas emailed me one day and said, hey, Paul, where's that book? We need it. And I was like, well, okay, time to sit down and write. So the actual writing took place probably over the course of less than a year. But the research, the preparation, and kind of imagining the book and reimagining the book and making notes and reviewing notes and arranging notes, that process, that whole process probably took 5 to 7 years. Yeah.
So all of the research in the archives that you refer to, was that self-funded? Was this before you had a book deal?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I got a little bit of funding from my university, then Penn State, and hats off to them. But it wasn't a lot, maybe $1,000 or so. So I had to supplement that with my own funds, which, believe me, was exciting to do. But of course, you know, had I more funds, then I maybe could have spent more time at the University of Chicago, certainly more time at the Audio Archive, and there are riches yet to be discovered.
So when you were doing that research and you made the choice that you were going to write a book, did you have a predetermined idea of what you were trying to say and what you wanted to focus on? Or was the process of research kind of led by discovery to discover the story that you were meant to tell?
I had a general sense that I wanted to recover the social and cultural contexts in which Sun Ra was working and creating, just a very general sense. And it went about that far. I didn't quite know what the contexts were, and I had no idea at all of the shape the story would take once I'd moved through the available evidence. So the narrative of the book and the way the book ultimately ended up being structured, that emerged entirely as a result of the research. So the research was really kind of immersive, listening to everything, learning about everything. The great discographies and bibliographies that have been produced around Sun Ra's work were very, very helpful. All of that beautiful material at the Alton Abraham Archive, talking to people who have spent a lot of time studying Sun Ra, like John Schwed and John Corbett. That kind of immersive undertaking was the experience that gave rise to the shape that the book ultimately took. But that shape was a mystery for a long time. And I will say that there were different versions of the book that I kind of messed around with, experimented with before I arrived at the final shape that the book has taken.
Other than the information that you present and the perspective, there are two very unique things about your book. One of which is that kind of narrative framework and construction of how the book is laid out. So from a layperson's non-literary perspective, I would describe it as a semi-linear narrative, meaning that you're not telling an explicitly beginning to end story. You allow the subject matter, much like how Sun Ra presented his music, you allow the reader to drop in and out of this ongoing narrative. And in doing so, you also, in the chapters, kind of move that narrative along by breaking out compartmentalized themes, which speak to Sun Ra's art, life, music, but also the social and cultural aspects that were important for you to cover. And I think that that's a component of the book that makes it highly entertaining and also highly readable, yet also highly rereadable. I've read it twice through and got new things from it each time. And also your construction and how you've laid it out actually reveals itself to you differently with reading and rereading it.
That is so nice to hear, Christopher. I mean, you're like the best reader I could have, because you really affirmed the sorts of choices I made when I was struggling with how to organize the book. You're right to say that there is a gentle sort of narrative arc. But one of the problems I faced when I was doing all this research and immersed in all this material was just the extraordinary richness and bounty of Sun Ra's experiences and influences and aspirations. And there was a while there where I kind of stalled out. I was thinking, like, how do you tell a story that is so thick? And how do you keep so many issues in the air as you try to sort of narrate a life? Well, I had to give up a couple of aspirations. One was narrating a life. John Schwed did that really well. So I didn't have to do it again. I didn't have to, in other words, feel responsible to say everything. And then the thing you just said about the relationship between Sun Ra's music and the book was a kind of revelation for me. What if you could structure the book around sort of thematic concerns, thematic in a musical sense even, where over the course of, say, a symphony, there are various themes that emerge. Well, that was the insight that really helped me with the organization, because I could then sort of treat a particular context or influence or thematic preoccupation as a kind of primary feature of a particular chapter, and then use enough short chapters to move through the extraordinary range of contexts and influences that characterize Sun Ra's creativity. So the kind of soft narrative arc provides a structure of the whole thing, but was really much more liberating to me was to I can write 21 little books. And each section, each chapter can have a sort of different thematic focus, but be loosely related by way of the arc of Sun Ra's experience in Chicago and then up to New York.
Which is a very inspired approach because you're able to accomplish a few ways of reading into the material, but you've also approached it in a way that's appropriate and approachable to different audiences. So your construction from a narrative standpoint and the thematic shorter chapters allows the reader to either sit and binge read the book over the course of a couple days, but also in doing so, it's a book that can sit on the table and you can pick it out, thumb through to something that appeals to you on that day and ingest it in that way. And the other thing that you've accomplished with a book as well is that you've presented it in a way that it's a great gateway book to a new Sun Ra fan, but present tons of information to a seasoned Sun Ra fan that's been listening to the music for years, has read all the available books. So in that way, I think it stands very proudly and in a friendly way with all the other Sun Ra books.
That is so gratifying to hear, Christopher. It certainly was my hope that it would not only be a great place to start with Sun Ra if you didn't know much about Sun Ra, but that there would be stuff here that would be interesting to, maybe even new to, a seasoned reader. Because it's those seasoned readers, this is a pretty committed crowd, the Sun Ra crowd. So it's an ambitious thing to think that you might have anything to teach them. So they were the crowd that worried me most, in a sense.
The other thing I think that is unique about your book and sets it apart was a very brave choice as a writer, because not only have you taken on the musical, social, and cultural implications of Sun Ra that in different ways other writers have approached, but the thing that really resonated with me was the ability, and again I say with braveness, to approach Sun Ra as a living, existing, thinking, feeling being. And there's 3 chapters in particular that I would love to hear from you about how you approach them and how you made those choices as a writer. And those particular chapters are Marionville, Washington Park, and Extensions Out. And for those of you that have not read this book, I highly encourage you to purchase it or head down to your local bookstore and buy it. But for those of you that haven't read these, Paul has taken an approach with these to take his archival research and the story that we might have already heard in a different way from other sources and basically recreate a real-time narrative of what Sun Ra would have experienced specifically in the Marionville, Pennsylvania conscientious objectors camp, in Washington Park in Chicago when he was engaging with other thinkers of the area and talking about his ideas in the park, and also Extensions Out, which covers the last moments of Sun Ra's time on the planet, where you're creating a character with a voice who is navigating these experiences. And they were highly emotional for me, because for the first time in a book context, I was able to feel like I was getting to know and experience Sun Ra, the being. So can you tell me about how that approach came to be and the space that you put yourself in to write those chapters?
Yeah, I can. It was sort of a scary decision. I wanted people to feel Sun Ra. His music is so full of feeling. But when you start talking about Sun Ra as a person, it seemed to me that in a lot of the research I had done, the person falls away and we're kind of left with this abstract persona that he creates. Sun Ra, the alien from Saturn. And yet the music is so emotionally direct. So I wanted to sort of direct some of the emotional power of the music back into the person who made it. And I was frustrated when I was writing the book because I had all kinds of facts and factoids and stories and historical bits and gimmicks. But if I only presented them in a critical or historically principled way, I felt that person fall away. So I thought maybe I'm going to have to do it with fiction. So you're exactly right. It was a very self-conscious choice I made. And I was really uneasy with that choice because I thought, here's what I thought. Well, I'll be totally straight up with you. How can I, as a white guy, write about Sun Ra, who is the biggest, most ambitious visionary in the Black music tradition? So I had real hesitation around that, and I avoided it for a long time. But then Sun Ra, Ra to the rescue, right? Sun Ra started to step forward to give me permission to do that. I remember that moment in Space is the Place, the movie, where he says, I am the living myth. And I realized that there was a large element of fiction in this persona he had created, and that fiction, the living myth, is one of the means whereby he is communicating his very deep feelings about life on planet Earth and the possibilities of a better tomorrow. So I thought, well, let's just see if there aren't places in the book where we might be able to communicate more directly through fiction than simply through criticism or historical accounting. Now, I felt that to hedge my bets and get away with this move, what I should do was to turn to fiction at moments where I could present a character based upon very rich documentation. So 2 of the 3 chapters that you mentioned, Marionville and Washington Park, while they present a fictional version of Sun Ra who speaks in his own voice, are chapters that are based very carefully on archival and documentary evidence that supports the fiction that I'm producing. So that, for instance, in the Washington Park chapter, while the circumstances are made up, they're imagined, the people on the grass, the Muslims down the path, while there's a certain amount of artistic liberty I took with the scene, the literal circumstances and the words that Sun Ra is speaking are, for the most part, pretty close to documentary accounts of his activity in Washington Park when he was behaving a lot like a street preacher and speaking from these broadsheets giving a kind of living message to a living audience from a perspective outside their usual spiritual tradition. So I was really careful to sort of ground the fiction in documentation, but I felt that it was really important to hear Sun Ra's voice in a context that didn't easily allow you to dismiss it as kooky or cranky or just way out, provide a sense of the circumstances that inspired his speaking, inspired his being, and give a kind of emotional authenticity or integrity to Sun Ra, the person, who, let's admit, is a very different kind of person. He's from Saturn, after all, by his own testimony. But nevertheless, you hear it in the music, a deeply feeling and deeply communicative person. So I wanted to give readers an experience of that. And then there was that Marionville moment, which became to me over the course of researching a really decisive moment for Sun Ra, when here's a man who's devoted to music, he's devoted to life, he's devoted to a better tomorrow. He's drafted to serve in World War II. He becomes a conscientious objector, but he still has to serve the war effort. So he doesn't turn up when he's asked to. And he ends up, first of all, in jail for a while, about a month, and then second of all, at a work camp for a while. And I increasingly came to see those two experiences as fundamental to Sun Ra's sense that, hey, I got to get off this planet and imagine better worlds. I got to leave this confined space for the open horizons of outer space. But I wanted to communicate that not in a critical way, not on the basis of historical facts and factoids, but I wanted to communicate a sense of what that might feel like for a guy who's passionately devoted to music, as Sun Ra was. So fiction came to my rescue, really because Sun Ra helped me to that solution, I think. The living myth lives through fiction, I think. So as a writer, why not avail myself of that possibility over the course of telling a story that comes from many different perspectives. So fiction remains only one of the perspectives from which we get information about Sun Ra, his life, his times, his music in the book.
Wonderfully said. I appreciate those insights. They give me even greater appreciation for your work. Thank you.
Could I say one more thing about the fictional element? Because you did also ask about the last chapter, the outro. That was a funny chapter. Like, how do you finish this book? How do you bring it to an end? Because Sun Ra doesn't end. We don't talk about Sun Ra dying. We talk about Sun Ra leaving the planet. So how do we finish things up? Particularly since the narrative, to the extent that there is one, sort of ends in the middle of his life. Well, this is really literally what happened. At the end of writing, after I'd gotten all of these different chunks together and sort of figured out how to order them into a narrative, I was left with all these great quotations from Sun Ra that I didn't get into the book. I thought, oh man, this is just this is a bounty, and yet I haven't availed myself of this bounty by working these incredibly rich statements, these oracular pronouncements that Sun Ra occasionally comes out with, well, really frequently. You didn't get them in the book, so how can I do that? Well, I thought about, what about Sun Ra's passage? That moment in Birmingham where he moves from this world from what we might call a deathbed. But for him, it's a place of transition. Well, it occurred to me that I could imagine him on that deathbed, which for him is a kind of launching pad, and from a perspective that is just sort of past the rational, sort of reviewing his life by way of this beautiful series of gnomic, poetic, visionary statements that I had culled over the course of my research. So while that scene is mostly an imaginative invention, it too, with the exception of a few sentences that kind of pull it together, is entirely a tissue of Sun Ra quotations. So we sort of leave the book then through Sun Ra's words at the moment of his own passage. And again, fiction seemed like a way of doing that allowed Sun Ra the person to be available to us.
And is that narrative tissue that you're referring to the one repeated line in that chapter, which is "Hold my hand"?
Yeah, that's my addition.
I'm also curious as to, from that perspective, as a language educator and an author, where you place Sun Ra in the pantheon of thinkers and communicators in regards to his writing and his poetry.
Yeah, the place I would start with that question is with his commitment to myth. Sun Ra used myth as a medium for envisioning the possibilities that he presents in the music. And that move to say, hey, mythology is a way of communicating that has its own possibilities, rich possibilities, especially for an expansive vision. He's not alone in that. And, it happens that, I received a particular kind of training in British literature, romantic literature specifically. And there are poets in that tradition who, well, they're very, very different. They're British and they're white and they're writing in the 18th century, who make a very similar move. Turn to mythology as a way of expressing a kind of grandeur vision that seems irreducible even to, say, the novel. Seems to be like poetry on a grand scale. I'm thinking in particular of William Blake and Percy Shelley, both poets whose range is very, very broad, like Sun Ra's, and poets who turn to mythology as a way of communicating, let's kind of call it a kind of visionary philosophy in a manner that is cosmic in scope. So I want to be really careful here because I do see how Sun Ra relates to that tradition, but it's a British tradition and a white tradition. It's a parallel tradition. What Sun Ra is doing that is so magnificent is really saying, hey, Black people, we have mythologies too. Let's think about Egypt, because, those British poets, they're not thinking about Egypt. They might go back to Greece, but they don't go to the cultures behind Greece, the Black cultures, really, that one can argue gave rise to Western culture, right? So let's go back to those Black mythologies and use those mythologies as a template for communicating a contemporary cosmic vision. So Sun Ra has a kind of relationship to those romantic poets, but he's working in parallel toward much different ends. He shares with those poets kind of a political agenda. Hey, let's change the world and let's do it with mythology. But he's working out of a completely different tradition. And I think he begins this visionary enterprise with a call to Black people to imagine better worlds for Black people. So I do see how his poetry or his mythology relates to poets in much different traditions. As a poet now, meaning just words on the page, lines that tend not to line up with a lot of white space, as a poet, it seems to me Sun Ra is of the utmost importance and is utterly undervalued, particularly in an American tradition. I think he's one of America's great poets, and he's largely unread as a poet, even as an African-American poet. And why do I think this is important? Because, as I did all this work on Sun Ra and read all this material, studied all these documents, I noticed he always refers to himself as a poet. And he talks about writing poetry all the way back to his childhood years. And he always speaks in a manner that relates music to poetry. My music is words, my words is music. That strange reversible sentence. I think we need to take that very, very seriously. That raises the question then, how is the music related to the poetry? And how can we see the poetry as every bit as important as the music? Something that often falls away from recordings of the orchestra and Sun Ra in performance is the large amount of poetry that often accompanies performance. In the later stages of the orchestra's travels, they were presenting cosmodramas on the stage. And there are some important recordings of them. But the verbal element of the poetic register is a really important part of the music and part of the larger project of myth that seems to drive Sun Ra's creativity. So seeing him as important as a poet, was probably my secret agenda in the book as a literary scholar and someone who was trained really in reading poetry. My secret agenda was to get people interested in Sun Ra's poetry, which is very weird, by the way. And it's kind of unlike anything else out there. But to take it seriously as poetry and the means, therefore, of communicating another kind of wisdom, and see how that might also shape the relationship that we have to the music. So yeah, I wanted to rehabilitate him as a poet very, very much.
And have you had the opportunity to make Sun Ra's poetry a part of your teaching curriculum?
Oh, Christopher, yes. Yes, I have. One of the joys of this project is that it has left me teaching Sun Ra. So in almost any context. I don't care what course I'm teaching. Sun Ra somehow finds his way into the course. And it's the music, of course, but it's also the poetry, and it's also the prose. These typed broadsheets that he wrote in the 50s when he was going down to Washington Park and playing the part of a street preacher. These typed broadsheets, they're typed out in prose. It's very strange prose that contains a very strange message of, let's say, occult wisdom as a means of transforming social reality for Black people. Let's say he presents in those broadsheets a completely weird and bizarre and beautiful rereading of the Bible for the purposes of liberating specifically Black people from a white reading of the Bible, which enhances their subjection. So the prose becomes important too. And I always lay on my students a good dose of those very strange but very illuminating broadsheets, along with a healthy selection of poetry from the one collection that is readily available that bears the title, The Immeasurable Equation, which was the title Sun Ra wanted to use for publishing his own volume and did use for self-publishing his poetry. He tried to publish his poetry in the usual way, sent it off to commercial presses. And he once got back a note from an editor that says, "Dear Mr. Ra, thank you for submitting your poetry, but it seems like it's written in a different language." And he took that as a compliment, because the world needs another language, Yeah, and the poetry is very strange, very challenging, but if you stick with it, it's just illuminating in this deep spiritual sense.
Now, I will admit that I have read and reread Sun Ra's poetry and Immeasurable Equations, and I struggle with it as a reader as far as rendering it and hearing it internally in my brain.
Yeah.
Or have you had the opportunity to present the poetry in a spoken word environment, and do you find that it's easier to understand when presented in that way?
I do. I think it's easier and maybe better read out loud than read on the page. And here's why. Sun Ra thinks about poetry as sound. Sun Ra thinks about word as sound. You and me, we were raised to think about words as meaningful, and we tend to listen to words for their meaning. So we kind of listen through the sound to what a word means. Birth, being born, right? But Sun Ra, as a musician, and this is really a cool move, he hears words as sounds. Maybe sounds first and meaning second. And that's a very important move, because from Sun Ra's point of view, the meanings of the English language, which remember is a language built by the English, white people. And what did they do for hundreds of years, 400? Sell Black people. That language is built to oppress Black people. So using it unreflectively is sort of going along with the terms of your own subjection. So disregard the meaning of the language, because the meaning is going to enslave you. Disrupt the meaning by listening to those words as sound. So like the word I just used, birth, it's a sound before it's a meaning, right? For us, birth. Oh, we're born. Birthday. Oh, let's celebrate a birthday, right? For Sun Ra, it's a sound. Birth. So if you hear that sound, birth, what do you hear? Yes, you hear birth, like being born, but you hear birth, a container, like on a ship, right? A room, a place in which you're trapped, right? But also you might hear birth, earthed, okay? So now, to be birthed is to be earthed, right? You would put all those meanings together by way of the sound. It's the same sound. Now you got an equation that says to be born is to be confined to the earth. Okay? So by listening to the words as sounds, Sun Ra is able to disrupt the words as meanings and sort of open up possibilities that then are associated with music, possibilities of other kinds of sounds and prospects. So what I try to convey to my students is, one of the weird things about this poetry is that it doesn't take its words seriously as meaningful, but as occasions for producing another kind of possibility. And producing that other possibility comes through sound. So just like say the poem out loud. And if you end by saying, I don't get what that means, oh, that's a start, right? Because meaning is part of the problem. You got to disrupt the meaning. The sound helps Sun Ra do that. And then you're able to talk about other possibilities. You know, the sounds of birth, birth, and birthed, you know, that's an equation that equals subjection. So let's imagine something else. Let's think of other sounds that'll take us there. And I think that the poetry is full of other sounds that take us other places, other planes of there, right? To use a very strange phrase that Sun Ra uses to title one of the records. And that the sound of those words will carry us to and into and maybe through the music too. So there's that reversibility again, sounds and words, words and sounds. They work together. So I'd say, you know, if the poetry is weird, just sound it out and hear what's going on with the sounds. And you know, the sounds might open you up. But again, this is a very strange way of writing poetry, and it's not the way poetry gets written much in the English language. So people have trouble with the poetry. It's really difficult, and it's really exciting.
I'm going to assume that most of the students that you're teaching this to are previously unfamiliar with Sun Ra. What's their reaction?
Oh man, it ranges from, you know, terror to bewilderment to resistance to obsession. But there's a lot of work that I feel I do to just kind of gently work through the resistance. You know, I think a lot of people say, well, this is weird, and it is. And so a lot of work we have to do is just, hey, let's read it together. Let's puzzle it out. Let's kind of read the poems improvisationally. See where they take us. Talk about the sounds we hear. Kind of create a safe community, you know, in which we can begin to appreciate what's going on at the level of the sound, but appreciate it together. A safe space also where everyone can say, nah, this is not for me. This is too weird. I don't get it. Because I think that resistance, you know, I think that saying no, that's the first move towards saying yes. So you have to be open to it. And maybe people don't get past that. That's okay. For sure, the music isn't for everybody. Although I might argue that there's something for everybody in Sun Ra's music, broadly considered, you know. The poetry isn't for everybody either, but what's gratifying is that there's never been a class in which I haven't won a handful over. And they come out saying, yeah, this is something else, something I haven't heard before, but I'm interested. And because they're younger people, that gives me hope. You know, it's like, well, you know, maybe they'll go out and talk to another person who talks to another person. And somewhere in the future, there will be an actual trustworthy edition of Sun Ra's poetry. Because I think one of the other problems with Sun Ra's poetry is that it's just hard to get to. You know, he self-published it. He published it in very strange ways on the back of album covers, in promotional material, in his notebooks. So it's kind of spread all over the place. It doesn't have sort of the scholarly stamp of approval, you know, that a good scholarly edition provides. So it's easy to overlook, maybe easy to resist or dismiss. But if we work at it, you know, and even just simply give yourself up to the sounds of it, I think a few people, and maybe more than a few people, can come out of that experience, the experience of reading Sun Ra's poetry, kind of enthused and enriched and willing to try some more.
I'm curious, like you had talked about your initial experience with the music, and in your case, it being a somewhat scary thing, and like some of the students' reaction that you conveyed, this is really weird. I think that would be a natural reaction to 99.9% of the people. But as you also said, as I'm sure lots of people that are Sun Ra fans can testify to, it sticks with you and it doesn't let you go. So I'm curious if you've had any experiences where a student will come back to you many years later and say, it was really weird, but it wouldn't let me go. And years later, now I'm a huge Sun Ra fan.
Oh man, I'm thinking of 3 in particular. And it's just what you said, Christopher. These are students the thing about teaching is you never know what its effects are. You have these students for 15 weeks and then maybe they'll take another course, but that's about the most you can hope for. And then they go off and live their life. But there are these occasions where you run into them later. And on 3 occasions, I've met former students who have said, hey, I'm still listening to Sun Ra. All right. Hey, I'm still even reading Sun Ra. And in one case, I just love this case because it's too much. In one case, the young woman who I knew almost 20 years ago, who became a poet, and our paths recently crossed again. And she said, hey, I've kept reading Sun Ra's poetry, and it shapes my poetry. So there's a way in which his creativity, in language is now available as inspiration, an example for other people who are creators in language. And so that's like the most gratifying thing that could possibly happen. Doesn't happen very often because you don't see old students very often, but that's the hope, that you hand them this music and you hand them these poems and that they just get stuck all over their hands, and they can't shake it off or smear it off, and it ends up kind of changing their lives, because that's going to change the lives of the people around them too. And that's what Sun Ra wanted, I think. And you know what? I guess that's part of what I wanted to do with the book, is just promote the interest so that people could receive it and pass it on, And I can do that in classroom too, because that makes for more listeners, and more responses and more possibility that those better worlds await us, I guess. That's the big payoff for Sun Ra.
This universe is endless, and everything in it is endless. How can it be an endless universe if everything is not endless? This universe is endless, and everything in it is endless. How can it be an endless universe if everything is not endless? That is a part of it. Every beginning is an end. Look back and see. It's in the past. Every beginning is the end of some endlessness. Look back and see. It's in the past. Every beginning is the end of some endlessness. But the past is an eternity all its own. It is not a part of the endless universe, because the past had an end. It is the realm of the ended. Look backward at the past, and you will see all the beginnings are there. Look backward at the past, and you will see all the beginnings are there. If you have an end in view, what's your aim, desire? Be careful. Do not make the end you seek the end. There are different kinds of ends, like bookends are, and bookends are, but bookends end. What does the law of bookends say? That is the answer of the way. When they are booked, they're in the book.
So in discussing your book and Sun Ra's poetry and the literary tradition, I want to get back to the title of your book, A Pure Solar World, Sun Ra and the Birth of Afrofuturism. The topic of Afrofuturism itself, I will admit that personally it's a term that I struggle with making sense of in application to Sun Ra. Because it's a term that Sun Ra predates. It's a term that he didn't use. And as you talked about putting poets into a historical context, my gut reaction to that term is that it is revisionist. Sun Ra's message and myth and legacy does everything that it possibly can to move against those restrictions. So from your perspective, where does Sun Ra fit into the concept of Afrofuturism
Mhm.
beyond being the grandfather of it? And does his adoption into this very, very important and necessary movement hurt or help his legacy?
Boy, that's a challenging question, Christopher. And I'm going to
I
take
know
a
you're
shot
up
at
for it.
I'm going to take a shot at it. Because I'm going to start with that word Afrofuturism, because you are right. It's not a word that Sun Ra uses. It's not a word that he had available. And I'll betcha he wouldn't have used it in the way a lot of people do. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean that often that word is used in kind of a narrow aesthetic sense. Afrofuturism is a style that crosses Black culture with maybe science fiction or a vision of the future. Then you can see how that relates to the precedent of Sun Ra's example. He's doing something very similar. He's going way back to Egypt, and he's reaching way forward to the end of time, right? But he's using the Black tradition to imagine better tomorrow. So he connects with that tradition in that stylistic way. And it seems to me a good thing if contemporary Afrofuturism can look back to Sun Ra and say, oh, there is an inspiration for us. Now, here's the trick. Sun Ra is so much more than a style. He's so much more than aesthetic. And the whole book is devoted to recovering social and cultural contexts that enrich our sense of the very broad vision he was offering us. So, although I do not make this point in the book, I would prefer thinking Afrofuturism in much broader terms than strictly aesthetic. And here's what I mean by that. For me, the true Afrofuturists are the dislocated Africans who are shipped across the Atlantic and enslaved and have the vitality and the wherewithal to, first of all, keep living, and second of all, to imagine alternatives to slavery. Okay, so there's a much broader and richer sense of Afrofuturism that we could use. When I teach, I use that broader, richer understanding. For me, the early Afrofuturists were the Blacks who resisted slavery because they did that on the basis of a vision of a better tomorrow, right? You say no to enslavement. You say yes to the possibility of a better life. And that's sort of the Sun Ra move. So as an Afrofuturist, I see him in a long tradition of Black resistance that goes all the way back to the early days of colonialism and the slave trade. And if we think about Afrofuturism in those larger terms, then we're able to avail of ourselves of a lot more than just a sense of aesthetic possibility. Now, I'm not putting down aesthetic possibility. It's obviously part of Sun Ra's program. Think of the cosmodramas, the stage performances, the costumes, right? The dancing. He's using art, though, and I think Afrofuturism at its best does this, as a cultural politics, as a means of changing the world, transforming the world, really as a weapon for liberation. So I can console myself with the Afrofuturism label applied to Sun Ra when I see him in a long-standing tradition of Black resistance to subjection, and then when I situate him in his own cultural moment as using music and poetry and art as a form not just of making cool new works of art and so forth, but as a form of imagining new tomorrows, better worlds, and really urging and moving people toward those greater political and spiritual possibilities. Now, does that help? Have I heard your question?
Absolutely. And I think that you've really encompassed what I took away from the book and what I've heard you refer to repeatedly, that really on a larger scale, the real key lesson to this book is how one being envisioned a greater future and how we might learn from that and put it into practice and do so ourselves.
Right. That's the really big challenge of Afrofuturism as Sun Ra would practice it.
Thank you so much. The conversation has really been fun. but it's given me a lot more insight into the greater intention behind the book so that I can read it for a third time.
I want to say, too, that it's out in an audiobook. So if reading is not your thing, you can dig those sounds.
Everything is ridiculous. Everything is ridiculous. You're on the other side of the end of time. You're on the other side of the end of time.
What are you working on right now? What's your next project?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because like I said before, Sun Ra has been so good to me. And the project I'm working on comes right out of Sun Ra. Here's how. I got an email out of the blue from someone who asked if a friend of hers couldn't meet the author of the Sun Ra book. I'm like, well, yeah, any friend of my book is a friend of me. So we arranged a meeting, and I sat down at a table over a cup of coffee with an elderly gentleman who began talking about his life. And the more he talked, the more familiar it seemed. And then I realized that the man I was talking to, and this name may or may not mean anything to you, but the man I was talking to was Jimmy Hops. Jimmy Hops was a free jazz drummer of no small achievement, played with Pharoah Sanders for 5 years, Roland Kirk for many years too. And then at the height of his powers in the 70s, he disappeared. He dropped off the scene. And he took this spiritual journey that led him to Tibet and Japan, ultimately back to Denver, Colorado. And here he was, I'm sitting having coffee with him. So the book I'm working on now is tentatively entitled The Afterlife of Jimmy Hops, and provides an account not only of his life as a jazz musician, but of this break that he experienced and this spiritual journey that he undertook. And the hook to Sun Ra is that Jimmy Hops, who I know now as Baba Jimmy, because as he says, he was Jimmy Hops, but he no longer is. He played with the Sun Ra Orchestra for 33 days in the late 80s. So he has a direct connection to the Sun Ra project, and we came together. Well, I like to think Sun Ra brought us together. So that's what I'm working on now.
Excellent. That was unexpected. Oh, I look forward to that. And there's another Sun Ra connection with Jimmy Hops. He also appeared as a musician on the CD release by the Marshall Allen-led Sun Ra Orchestra called Song for the Sun, which was the first post-Sun Ra Orchestra release. It's all connected.
I think it is, actually. I think it is. I think Sun Ra brought me and Jimmy together, and I'm really grateful for Sun Ra's guidance.
So if anyone is interested in keeping up with your work and connecting with you and buying your books, what's the best way to reach you in cyberspace?
Well, my email is always open, and it is my name, paul.youngquist@gmail.com, and I'm available through the University of Colorado Boulder, where I work as well.
Paul, thank you so much for your work and what you've shared with us, but also thank you very much for your time today, and I learned a lot.
You're so welcome, Christopher. It's been such a pleasure, and I thank you for getting in touch.
Thank you so much, Paul. Take care of yourself.
You too. Take care. You will.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Excerpts of the music of Sun Ra are used with permission of Sun Ra LLC. Copyright 2020, Sun Ra Arkive with a K.
Interested me so that I dare to knock